So the first thing that can be put to a good use in real life is the valuation framework, aka the super growth equation. So as a human being, we make multiple decisions on a daily basis. Some are trivial, some are simple and have immediate result. But when we encounter a somewhat complicated decisions that are not immediate, but rather need us to look through the whole time horizon, or a scenario which has a perpetual effect, we might need a better tool. So in this class, we learned the tool called the valuation framework, where I think personally we should have that in our brain's memory. It is a handy function to understand how the world works, how people are making valuation decisions. So this function takes multiple inputs and can cover quite a lot of real life scenarios, from basic things like should we rent a house to some more serious scenario like how countries' policies are set or should be set. But however, when using the tool, we should also know that there are several limitations in a way that the equation is not suitable for quantitative reason, but rather for qualitative reason. So the key takeaways here is to understand the intuition behind the equation and try to familiarize ourselves to be able to use the framework without much thinking. So we should understand how each variables affect the output of the function. So here in my screen, the framework has many forms based on its assumption, but the one being shown here is the supergrowth equation without the adjustment factor. The red line here is the first piece of the equation where it captures the supergrowth in the first n years. And the second piece in blue here is the steady state growth. In this case, it's assumed to be in perpetuity. And generally, you get a higher magnitude of the second piece. So the notion of what you get, what you created is not absolutely correct because most of the component in the outcome comes from the boring steady state growth over here. And that's why most people fight really hard to be in a position of an already successful company, for example. We should have an intuition where if we try to increase the pullback, there's less cash flow of us to get to capture, but we are compensated with a higher G, which will give us a higher next stage cash flow. So we'll see that this function actually captures the dynamics of what happens to the outcome in each circumstances. And the trade-off is always short-term for long-term. In another form of equation where there's an adjustment factor or there's a terminal value to how much we can potentially harvest in the boring steady state growth. And for sure, it does not mean that if we keep investing, it will be beneficial. We should keep that in mind. And we can consider a case where we work in a company and the company does simple stuff and get disrupted very easily. And in the end, um, the N2 can be very small. And the benefits from the second part is even lower than the first part. For example, here in 2 3. And that's why companies need to work hard to maximize N2 to maximize the length of the harvesting period. And maybe that's the reason why people that inherit an ongoing successful business from the past generations are so wealthy. Coming back to the slide, we can see that this framework is flexible enough for us to apply it to understand various scenarios that occurs in our world. From, for example, the company valuation that I just demonstrated, or to make a decision on should we pursue higher education. For example, if we're taking additional classes while working in a company. By doing that, we're paying or pulling back some money or we invest to gain new knowledge. And as a result, we should expect higher G. But in some case, when we take part-time classes, our boss doesn't notice it. So we need to make sure that he or she knows and increase our G, our growth of the C. So getting higher education is essentially upgrading yourself to have maybe a higher C and G after the work you have put in. So in the end, the C would become C sub N, which um, is a new cash flow we are harvesting in the second phase of the equation. And as I already mentioned, we have limited N. So this equation can also explain why sometimes getting a higher education doesn't make you richer, doesn't make sense in the long run. So you might subject it to overinvestment. So it really depends on the variables, especially the G's. And also apart from higher education, the framework also help us to understand why a certain laws make or do not make sense. Like in child labor, it is generally bad because of the equation. If the G just follows an inflation rate, the labor does not get any pension or retirement in the long run. So this equation does allow us to extract, to decompose the component. And people should think more about the second component where he or she would be able to enjoy in their later part of life. But there's also a devil in the details. So poor family with no savings could not afford to not have an income. So they might prioritize the first component of the equation. So people with no safety net, with no cash flow available will have a higher discount rate because it is more risky for them. So that's why it's kind of unfortunate to be poor. And that's why, uh, in general, we need subsidization for people that are unfortunate with high R environment. Apart from the public policies, we can also use the framework to understand why people in different generations, different positions have a conflict of interest. We can boil it down to comparing the PV on each perspective and so on. This is a graph where the x-axis is actually the R or the discount rate. So as you can see here, as R increases, it exponentially decreases the second component of the equation even faster than the first component. And there is a point of intersection where sometimes for people with higher R, it does make sense for them to think in short term, not long term. This is an intuition that we should also keep in mind. Another caution on the G variable. So most people believe that higher the PB, the higher the growth. But in reality, we see that it actually decreased the return on equity of a particular investment. So when you try to increase too much PB, the R increases. That means it is riskier for the cash flow. And in the end, you might overinvest. So we can summarize the relationship between each variables in the framework just like this. C can assume to be independent. It depends on how well you can generate cash. And G is a function of PB, but there's a diminishing return in a way that ROE has an inverse relationship with PB. And R is a function of circumstances of the cash flow, where the components are interest rate and risk premium.
Now that we are familiar with the valuation framework, we can move on to understand more about countries' life cycle of growth. So we learned that countries cannot grow forever because it grows from growth of population, skill, technology, adoption, and capital accumulation, which will eventually plateau. And at some point when it's very old, there will be demographic transitioning where old population will pass away and they will face massive population shrinkage and become young again, like in Italy. Countries will follow the life cycle, which consists of three stages: young, prime, and old. In the young phase, they will have young population, low education, poor infrastructure, and export-oriented economy because they are then working for the whole world using their resources. In the prime phase, they have better education, technology, infrastructure, and they shift from export-oriented to domestic consumption because when they become wealthier, they are willing to consume more. And at the O phase, for example, Japan nowadays is already wealthy because they have accumulated wealth for a long time, and now they start to consume and import things from other countries. China is a perfect example of country following this life cycle. After they opened up the country, you can see how they shift from low-skilled labor to the highest quality OEM manufacturer nowadays, and they shift from having around 36% of GDP coming from export, now down to around 17%. Now that I understand this concept, I understand a lot more about the middle income trap that Thailand has been in. I see clearly how Thailand didn't follow the proper life cycle that we learned, like Taiwan or Japan or China. So since 2017, Thailand's wage rates have already been too high to compete against low-wage nations like Vietnam and Myanmar, and yet Thailand still lacks sufficient innovation and skilled personnel to compete against the knowledge-intensive industry countries like Japan or Germany. So even though our government has said since 2017 that they want to upgrade Thailand to Thailand 4.0, where we imagine ourselves having our version of TSMC, but until nowadays, I can only see them building infrastructure, but never really properly invest in healthcare education. So I think it is very crucial for privileged Thais to understand this life cycle of countries and understand more about this middle income gap issue that we are having, and also to act on it more or less. We also learned about inflation. So we learned that inflation means the increase in commodities prices and also in wage, and normally with the same percentage. And even though most people think of inflation as something bad, but actually if inflation is less than 10%, it's neutral, while hyperinflation is really bad. So in the world without inflation, there will be no wage increase, which can actually lead to negativity rising among the workforce, as most people are actually not very aware of inflation. And the real cause of inflation is having the increase in wealth without having the corresponding increase in the production of goods or services. We also learned about gold standard and how governments agree to fix their currency to US dollar, while US dollar fixed their currency with gold and silver in order to prevent hyperinflation after World War II. Then, as the world becomes more productive, the US broke away from the gold system due to the limited supply of gold and silver. Now, as a free-flowing currency, the US government can always print more money if the money supply is still considered appropriate comparing to the underlying economy. And government printing money means having central bank expands their balance sheet or borrow money from God. Central bank then lends out this money to the government and other banks, and government spends money on people and public projects, even though it's often inefficient. Most people think that printing money creates inflation, but in this class, we have learned that it's not always like that. So being inflationary or not totally depends on how the government spends money. If the government spending does not create production, for example, buying weapons or spending money on war, then it is inflationary. On the other hand, if the government spends on useful infrastructure, then it's non-inflationary. We also learned that inflation is not bad for everyone. For example, if you are in debt with fixed interest rate, then you actually benefit from inflation. And among so many key takeaways from this chapter, I think the most surprising thing for me is to learn that inflation is not necessarily bad, since I have always thought of inflation as something wicked and scary. And one very important lesson here is we need to be cautious that our wage increase has to be in the same level of inflation or even higher than inflation, or else it means that our real wage is actually decreasing. Looking back, I have always felt satisfied having salary raise every year, even though it's about the same level as inflation, because I didn't know any better that it actually means that my wage was about the same level every year after the raise. Having learned this, I understand why my very skilled and hardworking friends would change their role and their employers every few years, from being investment bankers to data scientists, or from working at a tech startup to working for Facebook. It's because they make sure that their wage increase actually exceeds inflation every year. And that's why we see these aspiring employees stay competitive in the labor market.
Hello, my name is Aleš and now I'm going to talk about business cycles. Based on Keynes' teachings, economies go through cycles over time. These cycles are periodical fluctuations that affect employment, income, and output. On the picture below, we can see that such a fluctuation means that economies grow, and once they reach a peak, they start falling, and vice versa. Moreover, now we also know that countries age over time and that the older the country, the slower the growth. Lastly, I know that in the short run there can be some deviations from its trend line. The trend line means average past performance of a country. And once we see this deviation, it might be a sign of overheating or underperforming. Another element causing deviations can be short-run shocks, which can be either natural disasters such as drought, floods, or earthquake, or they can be caused by humans, such as a war, or they can be unrelated to any of these, such as a spread of a dangerous virus. As I mentioned before, economies can overheat, which creates a bubble, and this bubble usually leads to a crisis. Overheating can be spotted by signs such as higher GDP growth than its previous trends, high inflation, a lot of retail investors actively investing without some deeper thinking, institutions lending aggressively, and investors supporting bad projects. Basically said, there is a lot of optimism which causes overly high growth, which means overly high G. I already mentioned optimism, which is a short-term shock to the economy. On the contrary, pessimism means that businesses do not want to borrow even with low or negative rates. Retailers start selling, usually with loss. People do not want to spend money at all, and banks do not want to lend, which causes decline. However, there are also structural effects that have long-term effects, and these are usually harder to be fixed. Structural growth can be caused by technological development, improvement in geographics, improvement in infrastructure, and so on. On the contrary, structural decline can be caused by aging demographics, isolated economy, or bad politics. So in this chapter, we learn how economies go through cycles over time, which in the short term can be affected by some unexpected events, and the long run by structural development. Moreover, economies can also overheat, which usually causes a bubble that leads to a crisis. Also, we understand that majority of a country has an effect on its growth. Now we can have a look at what governments can actually do to control the economy. So there are some tools that governments can use, such as increase the interest rate, which slows down the economy because it lowers the value of the projects. It also increases cost of capital and makes more expensive mortgages. They can also provide more money through quantitative easing. They can also do financial operations on the market. And also, as Kira mentioned, governments can print money. Governments can also do investments to provide job opportunities and improve infrastructure. And lastly, governments can modify taxes or provide incentives and so on. Unfortunately, common reasons why economies experience structural slowdown are related to politics, such as political instability, corruption, bad policy making, or decline in investing into infrastructure. Moreover, politicians often make bad decisions because their main aim is to secure votes. So they unfortunately think from short-term perspective, which means that they provide solutions through easy and not sophisticated policies, and they just print money for no reason. Thanks to this chapter, we learn how governments can and must control economy, for which they have several tools. However, these tools are not often used well, since the aim of politicians is mainly to secure votes instead of to secure long-term prosperity for a country. Now we can have a look at deficit and national debt. So deficit basically means spending more than receiving, which is financed thanks to borrowing from others such as banks, insurance companies, mutual funds, or foreign governments. A deficit piled up over years is called national debt, which does not necessarily mean a bad thing, especially if it's owned to its own people and managed well. Such debt usually grows during recession and with populistic governments. For a comparison, a country with the biggest national debt in 2022 is Venezuela with 340% to their GDP versus Brunei with 3.2% as a country with the lowest national debt. In the class, we are shown two examples of crisis. Firstly, the Japanese bubble, which was caused by a very prosperous era, optimism, maturity of the country, and good structural development. This bubble ended up with fall of the stock market and real estate bubble. This whole situation caused switch in Japanese people's behavior, so they stopped spending money, they lost their confidence, and in total this caused 25 years long era without much progress for the economy. Moreover, the Japanese government has had to keep pumping money into the economy to keep it alive somehow, which also created many so-called zombie companies, which are companies controlled by debt. However, Japanese government cannot allow these companies to go bankrupt because it would cause deeper issues. The second example was the European crisis, which happened after Greece entered the Eurozone, but they overvalued their currency, which caused their inability to export anymore since they stopped being competitive. Since they already had euro currency, they could not print their own money, so they had to either default to those who lend them, mainly Germany and France, or to borrow from the EU for a low rate. However, since the Greek government was aware of the fact that if they have defaulted to Germany and France, it would cause them complications, so the Greek government started threatening the EU to obtain cheap money. At the same time, they failed to properly manage their economy, so their debt only grew up. However, if they were not in the Eurozone, they could have printed money to devalue their own currency to become more competitive in the export again. So in this chapter, we learned that what debt is and that it does not have to mean a bad thing. Now, we know that debt also resists during recession because it usually helps to keep the economy alive. However, having a correct management is a must, since if once an issue occurs, it is hard to fix it and the situation usually has consequential effects.
International trading and currency fluctuation topics, we have learned about two frameworks in understanding international trading, where young countries such as China tends to be net exporter in terms of unskilled labor and raw materials in order to develop their countries. As these young countries accumulate more wealth over time and become richer, they start to be an importer to accommodate for the labor shortage, such as the US. So the cycle continues over and over again as countries aging and growing. ESG concept is applicable in understanding this country's position in international trade. For example, young and poor countries have higher tendencies to pollute environments in exchange of financial capital. Meanwhile, old and wealthier countries tend to not pollute their environments, rather willing to transfer the responsibilities to other emerging economies. Countries that choose to float their currencies have the power to influence their currency's exchange rates. For example, if a country wants to make its currency cheaper for whatever reason, such as improving export or discouraging domestic spending, the government will sell its own currency and vice versa. However, of course, countries cannot manipulate exchange rate as they wish, as this will possibly create an unfair trading advantage. For instance, Vietnam has been allegedly conducting currency manipulation by devaluing its dong and might get a fine for it. If a country tries to devalue its currency irresponsibly and other countries retaliate by doing the same, it will cause a never ending spiral, and the people in competing countries will be badly affected, significantly lowering their purchasing power, where everyone competing will lose in this war. So, are we willing to work many more extra hours for money in exchange them with our most precious asset, time to spend doing what we value most in life, and health? There are four main parties in investment management ecosystem: owners, consultants, managers, and servicing companies. Asset owners include sovereign wealth funds, public pension funds, and retail investors. Fund managers are categorized into institutional, retail mutual, hedge fund, and index fund. Consultants can specialize in institutional firms, 401k, financial advisors, or index fund. Servicing companies include brokerage, custody, auditing, and accounting. Understanding information asymmetry and agency issues among the ecosystem participants is imperative in understanding their interaction. Let me provide an example of personal stock ownership for an agency problem. A is an analyst for company B. Analyst A made a buy call for stock D under his coverage in his initial report. His wife later acquired the shares through a distant relative. This has created an agency problem, so in the follow-up report, Analyst A has the tendency to maintain buy recommendation for stock D since his wife has acquired it, even though evidence from the numbers say otherwise about the recommendation. Average investors will have no idea of what is happening behind the decision of Analyst A, or what we call as information asymmetry. Good corporate governance must take place, where Analyst A must disclose the personal trading activity and let other analysts draft the follow-up report. If good corporate governance is not in place, investors will tend to lose. Workers are compensated for not working during retirement as an appreciation for their contributions to the organization they have been working for. Or we can also say that we are paying them for not working because they are deemed to not be fit for working and may cause more problems than benefits that they can contribute. There are two types of pension system. One is called defined benefit, while the other one is called defined contribution. For defined benefit pension funds, there are three stages in its life cycle. Firstly, accumulation phase, where pension funds are funded by the organizations for the working employees. This is the phase where pension funds are rich in cash. Secondly, mature stage, where pension funds have started to gain return on their investment. Thirdly is the accumulation stage, where the matured fund must be used to sustain the retirees for lifetime based on their salary level and services. Top management have the incentive to pay the least possible amount of pension contribution as it directly hits the organization's bottom line, both private and government alike. This motivation has led to the issue of the pension being underfunded, where the present value of the fund's liability is higher than its asset. Much of the underfunded pension funds are blamed to the lower than expected investment returns, when the real issues have always been due to insufficient contribution to the pension system, overpromise of the pension benefits, and underestimating life expectancy. The defined contribution system, meanwhile, relies on both employees and employers to contribute to the pension fund, while the employees are still working for the company. This system relieves the burden of pension payment to retirees from employers in the decumulation stage, as employees have to bear the risk of the return on investment of the pension fund. If the pension funds are not performing well, then employees will bear the consequences. This is different from the defined benefit system, where employers instead must bear the burden of fixed amount that must be paid to retirees, regardless of the investment performance of the fund. Defined benefit provides certainty for employees, and employer must have strong cash flow to provide for the fund. Defined benefit system may create stability for employees, but it's not in favor of the employer. So for this reason, employers have more incentive to switch over to the fund contribution system where the risk of underfundedness is transferred to employees.